Caty is the executive in residence and co-director at the Center for Media and Social Impact at American University in Washington, D.C. here, and she's a senior strategy advisor to the Social Action Division of Participant Media, working at the intersection of social change communication strategy, entertainment, documentary storytelling, and impact research. Her work has been featured in the New York Times, USA Today, Business Week, Huffington Post, and PBS Media Shift. One of my favorite places. They've got all the dope, forward-thinking things that are happening. Like, they're in the cut. Nobody knows. You got to read PBS Media Shift. So she also co-produced produced two feature documentaries, Walmart, The High Cost of Low Price, and The After Party. A TV documentary and transmedia series, multiple half-hour documentary TV specials, and a 7-part documentary series. I mean, it just goes on. She's a producer, she's a thinker, and she's a strategist. There's a lot more here. You should pick up her bio, but the most important thing that she's going to be bringing for you today is her research. So I want to introduce her up to the stage and have her kick it off.
Okay, great. Hi. That's a lot. Listen, the thing I want to say about bios is that if you work for a long time, you get a long one. That's the main thing. Okay, so I am not using my notes, which I never do. So yes, I'm so happy to be here, and hello to Michael Lumpkin. So pleased to work with AFI Docs and always with Jennifer, who is quite amazing. You don't need to be anyone when you grow up but yourself. So thank you all so much for being here. This is such an important conversation, and I feel really deeply, both personally and professionally, that it's a conversation that needs to move much farther beyond the anecdotal, because when we just talk about these issues of diversity and inclusion in terms of anecdotal successes or moments, I think we actually miss the larger picture of what's happening. So one thing that I want to say from the outset that's really important for me to explain to you all about what we do at the Center for Media and Social Impact, among other things, we incubate production projects and other kinds of storytelling projects, but one thing that we do that we feel very strongly about is that we integrate with the field really deeply at all levels, with film festivals, with organizations like IDA, and we really find the questions that people are asking out in the space, and we answer those questions with research. And so again, that always moves us beyond the anecdotal into systematic examinations of some of these challenges that we face as an industry. We then package up our research and we give it first to the field, and we then repackage it and give it to academia, which is a totally different process that you all do not need to worry about for today. And so in that spirit, we were really interested for a couple of years in this question about diversity. We heard it come up in film festivals, in all kinds of convenings, and so we really wanted to examine it. So one of the things that I'm going to talk to you all about today, most specifically, is actually 2 studies that we have produced out of the Center for Media and Social Impact over the past year and a half that deal with this issue specifically. And the amazing thing about that is that we actually thought, when we started these studies that I'll tell you about, we actually thought we would be telling a celebratory story. So that's important to recognize right away. We thought, you know, if it is more diverse in some ways in documentary and independent storytelling, what is the story that we can share? And in fact, we found not a celebratory moment in a lot of ways. Okay, so I want to start this conversation by going right into the Oscars So White moment. So Oscars So White, by the way, was a conversation that excluded our field. It excluded us as documentary filmmakers. I don't know if you all paid attention to that. Oscars So White is a really convenient meme because we can see actors and actresses, and we can see 10 of them, and we can see that they are white. So it's a pretty straightforward examination, but I don't know if you all know that 20 years ago, not only was the conversation the same, but the outrage was the same. So this is 20 years ago. You can obviously see the cover of People magazine, and this is, of course, this year, Shame on Us from Variety, Oscars So White. But one point that I think is important, this is the Academy Board of Governors, and I'm not here, I really am here I wear lots of different hats, but I'm here today in a research capacity to tell you what we have found with data, not to solve or for advocate for any particular kind of change, because I think that's a conversation that starts with research. But this is not just the case of a singular body that looks like this, although it's important to see that it looks like this, right? But this is not just the case of singular actors. This is not a couple of bad people who are racist. That's not what we're talking about. We're talking about something deeper, as you all know. So I want to start with, in the Oscars So White theme here, and I'm going to make sure I use notes, because the first studies I'm talking about are not my own. This is really important research that came out of USC, an amazing woman named Stacy Smith, and she examined 414 films, television, and digital episodes in 2014 and 2015, and she was looking at directors and producers in terms of gender and also people of color. And see, here you can see it's pretty straightforward, and this is narrative projects. These are scripted projects in big Hollywood. And although I don't have a graph for this because it wasn't available, I can tell you that out of 407 directors evaluated, 87% were white and 13% were from underrepresented racial and ethnic groups. So this is in addition to gender. A similar study, a separate study from USC, examined Hollywood feature films. So now we're getting at something that's a little bit more of a comparative with our world when we're talking about either feature documentaries or documentaries on television. So they examined Hollywood feature films from 2007 to 2014. And here you can find that out of 700, hopefully you all can see that, out of 700 films and almost 800 directors, only 28 women worked as directors. So that is profound. But what about documentaries, okay? So that's where we are today. So of course we've had these incredible moments with women that we know, and I know Dawn Porter was here last year. I was sort of thinking, if she's here this year and she comes up in a slide, is that weird? But of course, we have these incredible women who have done incredible films that are not just artistic, but are actually changing things, right? So Laura Poitras' film, of course, which won the Academy Award a couple years ago, has opened up a conversation that was not being had about our rights to information. And Dawn Porter's film premiered, I'm looking at Eliza, premiered this week, right?
On IL.
Yes, on IL. I know, in the family, not your exact. So Dawn Porter's film also won, and I have my notes here to make sure I give her the appropriate recognition, the U.S. Documentary Special Jury Award for Social Impact Filmmaking at Sundance, which is a huge and incredible award. So have we solved it, right? We have these incredible women. This is the part about not assuming change because we have anecdotal moments, while at the same time, I don't want to not celebrate those moments because they are profound. But here is something that I thought was interesting. So while I was working on one of the research projects that I'm going to show you, literally while we were working on the data, I saw headlines like this come out. And these are legitimate, by the way. No quarrel with these headlines. Debuts from female filmmakers win 3 of Sundance's top 4 awards. Unbelievable, incredible. From Full Frame earlier this year, are women filmmakers finding more opportunities in documentaries? To a certain extent, yes, right? So I'll say that at the end as well. But again, the point is, if we have trade publications and we're only talking about these moments and we're not looking at the systematic data and an examination of what's really happening, we really are going to miss the pattern. And so while I was doing these studies, I had this data. I was like, the data is not showing 18 stories like this. It has a couple of stories like this. And so have we resolved this challenge? No. So now I'm going to get into some data. So I want to share the results from 2 studies that we have produced out of the Center for Media and Social Impact. One of them is my study. One of them is my study with my colleague, Pat Ofterheide, who everyone in the world knows, so I don't even need to describe her. But I want to start with something that's not our study, but it's important to go into. And I think this is the kind of work that we at the Center for Media and Social Impact want to be doing more of. So I'm saying that really loudly to you all. We always need funders for graduate students to help us do this work. But we will take on this kind of challenge. This is an amazing study, also done by Stacy Smith. Sundance, a couple of years ago, opened its records to Stacy Smith, this researcher at USC, and said, we want you to look at our records and tell us how we're doing in terms of gender representation. And so you can find here that out of 82 Sundance Film Festival films in 2013, and then larger trends that go back a little bit further, female documentary directors, 42%. I mean, it's stunning. Female documentary competition directors, 42%. And the piece of this that I find really important to keep in mind, and we'll get to this later, is Sundance is also known for mentoring directors and producers. And so I loved that this research was so thorough that, again, I'm going to quote here directly. They found that of the films that had been involved in some kind of a development lab or a mentorship lab at Sundance, female filmmakers are equally likely to succeed. So this, I don't know if anyone has a myth of the idea that women are not able to finish their films. That's not true in this particular context, right? So 80% of those films that start out in a lab environment, this includes women, go on to succeed at major festivals and get distribution deals. Okay, so that is a unique study, and so you're wondering, well, that sounds great, so what's up with the IndieWire piece? This is a quote directly from the study. They say, examining female participation at the festival as directors and producers from 2002 to 2013 revealed no meaningful change over time. So again, that's moving beyond the anecdotal. Okay, so now I'm going to get into our Oscar So White study for documentaries. So this is a study I want to give proper credit, because I see that Ken from IDA has just walked in. You didn't know I was going to say that, Ken? So he's like, I'm going to get my coffee before you reference me. So a while ago, I'm in LA frequently. A lot of my work originates there, and collaborators and so on. So I was having a meeting with Tom White, who's the editor of Documentary Magazine, and I love working with IDA and all different kinds of things. And we said, what kind of stories should we write before documentaries, before Oscar season around documentaries? This is months in advance. And so, we sort of noodled around this idea, and we kind of landed on this idea that we could do a study at CMSI that actually looked at what does it take to actually have a film succeed on the Oscar route. And by the way, it's not just because it's the Oscar route, because it's the Academy Awards. It's because the Oscars are a kind of surrogate to this iconic idea and set of symbols that really equal career sustainability. So when you're shortlisted for Academy Award, you have more opportunities, you have more access to funding, you have access to distribution deals that are actually going to pay you in a living wage situation, right? So it's beyond awards. So I just want to say that right away. This is not a vanity type exploration. So I went back to AU and we started working on this study, and it took us several months. And then when I realized very quickly was that this was not a study, and this is a content analysis in which we look at particular variables, descriptors of, I'm not going to go into a whole research discussion, don't worry, in case you guys are freaking out. But we examine through coding with multiple coders, we actually categorize observable traits. Okay, let me just leave it at that. So we were coding for a lot of different things. What film festivals do films go to? What kinds of distribution deals do they get? Are the films about sort of social issue impact type stories? Are they entertainment slice of life stories? We were coding for 16 different variables. What awards do they get? And so on and so forth. But one of the things that we were coding for directors only, and we're about to expand this, we were coding for race and gender. We wanted to know who are the people who are recognized in Oscar's shortlist. And for anyone who doesn't know, there's an Oscar shortlist for documentary films. Like about 15 films are recognized in this list around October, November of every year. And then, of course, those go on to become the 5 nominated films in the beginning part of the next year. Okay, so that's important to recognize. The Oscar shortlist is important to look at because, again, you can use the Oscar shortlist descriptor for your work for a long time. And again, career sustainability is the whole path. So what we recognized right away, and I remember sending a note to Tom, and I said, oh, this is a diversity study. I mean, that's the headline. I mean, I can talk about all the other stuff too, but that's really what it was. It jumped out so broadly. We're about to expand this study over the rest of 2016. We're going to go back a full decade. So it's going to be something like 150 films, probably many, many, many more directors. We're also going to code and look for producers and directors. But in this case, this was a bit of a pilot. So what we did was we looked at the last 3 years of Academy shortlisted documentary feature films. And you can see here that's 45 films, 56 directors, because there are some films that credit 2 directors, formally credited directors, official credits. And then we looked, of course, at shortlisted, nominated, and then the winning films. Okay, so now you guys are dying to know, what did we find? So we found this. I'm waiting for a gasp. No one's surprised. Okay. Wait till I show you the next one. Maybe you'll gasp. Okay, so what we found here is pretty clear, which is the overwhelming majority of credited Oscar shortlisted documentary film directors are white and male. And I'm not showing you the trend data here because that would be way too boring for a meeting like this, but I can tell you that the ratio has remained relatively unchanged over the last 3 years. Now, again, this will become even more fascinating to look at when we look back a full decade. Notably, in 1 year, 2015, no documentary directors of color were recognized at all, even on the short list, none. So we looked at here, just in case you all are wondering, so in content analysis that deals with observable data, that you can verify through certain means, but observable data that you find through public records. We're able to recognize white and non-white. We recognize federally recognized categories. And so that's why if you don't see distinctions, we can create distinctions, but it requires a lot more time and effort, which we'll put into the longer study. So that's why you see white and non-white here. So you all can see. We also looked at, actually, no, that's the next one. Okay, so we verified this through a number of different ways: self-identification, IMDb, articles. We had multiple coders. I should mention that in both of the studies that we're talking about, we very overtly and we're very careful about this. We had about 6 different graduate students working with us also as coders, and Pat and I supervised them, right? And more than half were students of color, so we were, and women. Okay, so let me show you what this looks like when you combine race and gender. So this is, again, Oscar shortlisted documentary directors for the last 3 years. So race and gender combined, you can see that 71% are white males. And you can see this slice, and again, you know that's the slides 1 and 2 go together, in case you all are doing math, a little bit of rounding here. White males, 71%, white females, 18%. People of color, you can see, is, between 10 and 11%, and it gets even smaller when you look at females of color and males of color equally represented. So when we look at Oscar-nominated directors, now remember that was shortlisted, right? So it's 45 films across 3 years. Nominated, so going even further up into the sort of path to Oscar, which again, you all are keeping in mind, it's not just about the award, it's a sort of surrogate to understanding in a lot of ways how we can actually have sustainable careers in this business. So out of the 18 nominee directors, 83% are white, 17% are directors of color. So it stays pretty consistent. So this I just threw in here, even though that's a whole other conversation. In case you all were interested, just as a little fun byproduct, what are the kinds of films that are nominated? It's actually social issues versus what I call entertainment slice of life. So what's the one that won 2 years ago? You guys know what I'm talking about. The Backup Singers? 20 Feet from Stardom? Yeah. Okay, so that's an example of that kind of film. Laura Poitras' film would be an example of the other kind, sort of contemporary social issues. That's just a little bonus for you guys. Let's get back to race and gender. So before I leave that, though, let me just put in a plug. This study is available now on our website. You all can have it. I think it's probably worth mentioning that we sent this to the trades just like those other Oscars So White studies, and they were not picked up. I don't know why. It's not either we are so busy celebrating our special diversity in our field, or we don't think it's worthy of real discussion. But we'll send it out again when we expand it. So again, expanding for the past decade. I'm sure we'll find similar patterns, but I remain open to finding something new, and we'll release that hopefully in January around Sundance time, right before the Academy Awards. Okay, so that's one way. A directly Oscar So White type of story, one way to look at this issue. But we know this is not the only way to look at documentaries and diversity issues. So this is our other study, and this is a study that Pat and I did together. So let me try to explain this one first, because it's a little bit more complicated. So in this one, we wanted to know, what does racial and gender diversity look like in terms of directors, producers, and characters? So lead characters, stories that are being told in public television documentaries versus commercial television documentaries. And here I want to recognize an important distinction in how we made decisions about operationalizing this examination. And so you can see here HBO docs and CNN films and POV and IL, right? So we have categorized those as what we call authorial strands of documentary programming. And what that means is mostly just for our geeky research purposes, but I think it'll be meaningful for you all to understand why we did it that way. The three below are public broadcasting, as you guys can see, Frontline, American Experience, and American Masters. Those are executive produced series that are largely baked inside the network, okay? So the authorial pieces, this is meaningful because these are the stories out in the world that are being created and curated. This is the independent film world on television that we're talking about. HBO and CNN films are in the same category as POV and IL in terms of curating and accepting and distributing those kinds of projects. So that's why a lot of our examination, when we wanted to compare authorial documentaries on public broadcasting versus the same category on commercial broadcasting, sometimes we looked together at HBO and CNN together, one lump, and POV and IL together as one lump, okay? So that's meaningful when you see the graphs. So what we did was we looked at all the films that premiered on the 2014 and 2014 and 2015 season. It's only a distinction because some people recognize the season that way, some people recognize it by year, okay? Let's just get that out of the way. So 165 films, and we were looking only at race and gender diversity, okay? So I'm not going to tell you what we found with characters, that would take longer, but let me tell you what we found. I know this is very hard to see, so I'll read it for you all. So for female directors, combined documentaries, again, 165 across all of these different networks. Here you can see we've put together, again, that authorial category, POV and independent lens representing public broadcasting, 45.7%, 46%, right? Should have rounded that up. And then HBO and CNN, 37%. So by the way, CNN and HBO, not too far behind. American Experience, interesting. I'm not going to pontificate about the data because that's for us to do later. But I'm just going to show it to you so that you're aware of it. So that's female directors only. We have a whole other very interesting conversation about female producers, which we'll get to. We call them workhorses. So directors of color, right? We've all been there. Okay, so directors of color. I love it when people take pictures of slides. It's my favorite. I'm going to slow down so you can do it. Okay, so directors of color is this, again, combined TV documentaries. So here you see a different story. So public broadcasting by far on independent documentaries is clearly exhibit, and again, I'm trying not to pontificate about the data because my job here is not as an advocate, it's to give you the information. In other roles, I'm an advocate. But today, so you can see 33% of the independent documentaries curated by public broadcasting documentaries are directors of color. HBO and CNN, you can see it goes way down. And then, unfortunately, also on public broadcasting, other forms of broadcasting not holding up. This is me trying to find my non-advocacy words. My non-editorializing words. Okay, so here when you look at producers, so a little bit of producer business here, when you look at gender and race together, and you look at public broadcasting, so here I'm circling for you all again these authorial series, and again, this is meaningful because these are the independent documentaries that are being out in the world that have a chance to be told, and I'll get on my soapbox for 1 second and say this is so incredibly important, not just for career sustainability, but for democracy, because we know how many stories are not being told, and increasingly, stories are being told by this kind of documentary. That's why this is important, okay? So I'll just take it to a higher level. I get back into the data. So here on POV and IL, minority producers, 28%, women producers, about 70%. But here, again, worth mentioning, CNN and HBO, a little close. Okay, so the point is, our job at the center, we're not trying to take a formal position on why this is the case. But it's important to recognize that this is the case. This is what's happening. So despite what we're seeing at film festivals, and what we may not be seeing at film festivals, to be honest, that does not necessarily always translate into licensing deals, distribution deals, broadcast dissemination. These are things that equal creating a career out of this work. And again, if you want to take the sort of the soapbox approach as well, we're also talking about access to information and stories that will or will not be told based on whose voices are excluded, right? So of 165 documentaries that aired in a particular season, particular year, 28% of those are minority producers on POV IL. I'm just reading one, and you all can extrapolate to the rest of the data. 70% are female producers. And then we have a lot more, and I'm so glad you all are interested in the sort of nerdy bits, because both of these are available on our website. You don't even need me to find them. Well, you might, because we just reorged our website. I'm not totally sure where everything is. But you could send me a note, and I will send you these studies. And this one is being published in an academic journal in 2 months or something, so you could have that version too. Actually, you know what? I want to mention one thing before I lose this thought. Later on, at the International Documentary Association conference in September, hopefully you're all going to that. It's very well done. There's Ken. We've been working on a survey of documentary filmmakers to capture a kind of state of the field. I'm not going to reveal any of that now, because that will be for that conference. But I will tell you that we're asking a lot of questions about diversity, about people's perception of diversity. And the perception of what we are doing on diversity is totally different than the reality, even among our people, right? Documentary film people. It's pretty interesting. I did not expect to see that. Because you kind of think, well, like, we all kind of know. But again, I didn't know until we did the data. Okay, so here I want to sort of tee up an ongoing conversation that we hope to be part of at the Center for Media and Social Impact. So here I'll say really overtly, we want to do more research. We want to answer more questions. Some of these ideas you'll see in the next slide, but we really want to work with the community to continue to ask and answer the kinds of questions that we need to ask and answer to continue to chip away at this. This is not just a story about mentorship opportunities, not just a story about what we do in film school. It's not just a story about who gets money, but it is all of those things. And who has access to big money in filmmaking. So here I wanted to give you all a little bit of too long, didn't listen, wrap up here about where we might go from here. And I'm not the only person. If we do a Q&A here, by the way, I don't think it should just be with me. I think it needs to be with us together. And this is a real sort of village approach. But just to sum up, yes, better in docs, but not consistently. And by the way, the bar is pretty low. So a little better in documentaries. And thank goodness for public broadcasting, is Eliza. But there's a disconnect, and again, this is me making an anecdotal observation here, but one that I think deserves real research. The disconnect between festival inclusion and career-making opportunities for funding and recognition is something we really need to examine. And not just, we need to move beyond trade articles that celebrate moments in time. They are worth celebrating, but to go beyond that, we need to look at what does it mean to have your film in 18 festivals? Does that mean that you have an opportunity for a licensing deal that pays you money? Does that mean that you get funding to have your next project made? We don't know. Sometimes it does. Is that consistent? We don't know, because we need to do the research. Career sustainability, this is me taking a little bit of a position, should be an underlying focus to drive additional research. So it's not just what will we discover, but to what end are we trying to discover these things, okay? So career sustainability is an important one. And this is a little bit duplicative. Do festival showings equal a path to career sustainability? Again, sometimes, for sure. Sometimes. Probably a lot of the time, but we don't know what that means and the intersection between race and gender in particular, because again, you can look at the Oscar level of this work and there seems to be a disconnect. We need to examine mentor opportunities. There are mentor opportunities and diversity funds popping up all over the place. They are incredible. We should be really grateful for them, but we need to examine the pathway to what happens after you experience that kind of a program. So examine mentor opportunities and programs for their connection to career success. Again, these are all operational as research projects, which again, we are ready to do. So a path forward that's not just about research, it's about a set of conversations. We think it would be really interesting at the center to do research about major festivals, directors, and producers, and following that path to career sustainability. So that is a massive study, by the way, that we would need a little funding to do. But if we looked at the top 5 festivals, for example, and we looked systematically at maybe the last 3 years of ranks of directors and producers, and we actually followed up to find out what happens with them in terms of career sustainability and opportunities. That would be a pretty amazing picture to paint. That hasn't been done yet. We're going to continue to track and report on diversity in documentary in all sectors and all the different ways that you can articulate our beautifully diverse field. We know there's so many different kinds of people that comprise our field. There's artists, there's people like me who are professors that also make films. There are people who are full-time makers. There are network people who make movies. So to continue to track this question in festivals, on television, in feature films, all of it. Mentorship, again, examine and replicate successful mentorship models like Sundance Institute's many labs. I know ITVS, there are funding opportunities, of course, which we know about. ITVS has an incredible diversity fund. There are other organizations that are working in that way. And then this final one, this is a great way to end. And this is not just, again, not just a conversation for me. I'm not the person with all the answers, but I'm a person posing questions. The tough public and private conversations. Private conversations sometimes are harder than the public ones, right? Where we actually examine this seeming disconnect between money at the Oscar level and other films. It's not just money to make the film, it's the marketing money that goes into a film even catching the eye of the Academy. That is not incidental, and you guys have probably read all the trade publication articles about the increasing costs of Oscar marketing campaigns. That's a whole other project, which is totally a private conversation because nobody will really tell you how much that stuff costs. So that is a bit of a wrap up here. So I leave us here collectively with this set of questions that we should keep our eye on and continue to ask and identify research opportunities, convening opportunities, conversation opportunities to start to really ask and answer these questions to really make some progress on this issue so that maybe in 5 years we can look back and we'll have some amazing trend data to show that something was sparked maybe from a day like today or from a conference like this one in which this topic was put front and center. And that is the end. Thank you. I made it in the time.
One thing that struck me is the percentages on women producers, how high those percentages were across the board of the authorial and the other categories.
Right.
My question is relating those high percentages to sustainability.
Yes.
And whether you looked at or were interested in possibly following up by looking at how many of those women producers were the same producers over time or a new crop each time?
Yeah, it's a great question. So I think in order to, we use a very particular research approach, again, this idea of content analysis, it really works for something like this because you don't have to rely on other people to open up their doors to get access to the data, so publicly available information that you categorize and code and analyze. So that would be an amazing longer-term project where we would take a subset of those and do that kind of follow-up. But yeah, I mean, look, in the public version, so we had a publicly accessible version of that study, and then we have an academic version that goes into a bunch of stuff that you guys don't care about, but academic people do. But in the public-facing version, we do sort of pontificate a little bit about the role of producers in documentaries. And we know, and again, this is as a producer myself, there's lots of patterns behind that. There's women not getting the credits they deserve, if we're honest, right? There's systematic access issues. There's who gets money to make the film. So we don't know the answer to that question, but there's something really dramatic lying between the idea of directors and producers who are credited in documentaries, no question. It just operates so differently in some ways than feature films, right? In terms of the level of formality of how much you discuss credits in advance versus, haven't you guys all been there, right? Like you're making the movie and you're halfway through making it and you're like, oh, what are our credits, right? Something we talk about with our film students, don't you? Gotta do it in advance. So Ken, I don't know, but would love to look at it.
We have a question from the internet. So I'm going to throw this out to everybody in the audience, not just to Caty. Who are the funders for this type of research? How can we help advocate for funding such work?
Yes. Can I partially answer that?
Yeah,
I know you didn't want me to answer it. We did these studies with no funding. So, because Pat and I are full-time professors, so like we're paid for. But that's very hard. I'm not going to go on a whole soapbox because like we're kind of all in the same boat, research and documentary. You know, every field I pick is not funded well. It's my special thing. But yeah, no, we did those, as we call those enterprise studies, meaning we think they really need to be done, and we will pull together research to do them. But to go into much broader research about the festivals and shortlists and all of that, we definitely need, not a lot of funding, but we need some funding. My research has been funded by a handful of organizations, the Gates Foundation, not on this kind of stuff. But you know, I imagine groups like Ford and MacArthur are probably the obvious candidates, and Fledgling Fund has funded research that I've done as well. But I would welcome ideas on this because we, you know, we need some funding to be able to continue to do this.
I encourage people to think outside of the box in terms of
Yeah.
thinking about, and this is what I have to do all the time when I'm working on social issue campaigns,
Yes.
because we've got to get that money from somewhere.
Yeah.
If you look at it from the standpoint of advocacy, sort of, in terms of like, or not even advocacy, but
Yeah.
just in terms of democracy and whose voices are heard and,
Right.
and bringing people to the table, I think that there are organizations that exist in the world that care about those kinds of things.
Mm-hmm.
And we should be thinking about making the case in that kind of way. Just throwing it out there. Michonne.
Yeah.
Okay, I have two items. One is a historical marker from your slide about the conversation Oscars so white being the same as 20 years ago. 20 years ago with the boycott, what was omitted was the fact that there was one woman, black woman, nominated for an Oscar for a narrative short, and that was Diane Houston. And she is related to Charles Hamilton Houston, who was the architect of desegregation.
Wow.
So that was omitted, and in some ways, I think some of these campaigns just basically promote people who we already see in the limelight, going back to what you said, what is omitted. The second question is your study looking at web series and streaming?
So one of the things that we looked at in the now nicknamed Oscar So White documentary study, which really has a longer title, one of the things that we did look at was, and again, this started out as a much broader study, and it is a much broader study, but it turns out the headline is really about diversity. But we did look at distribution platforms, and we looked at exactly, you know, I mean, we really coded very specifically for whether it had a broadcast run, theatrical run, yes, because Oscar nominated. And then we looked at not only did they stream or not stream, but in what particular platform. So that's not the same thing as web shorts, I recognize. But so we looked at that question broadly in that one study. But then beyond that, I mean, just a quick geeky thing. I mean, one of the things that you have to do when you do a research project like this, you have to actually create some kind of boundaries and limitations, because otherwise it becomes not actually a study, it becomes a series of observations. And so that's why something like Oscar shortlisted films or films that aired on this one year, so they become a way for us to operationalize the question. So in order to do something where we look at web shorts, we would have to create a whole set of criteria, which, by the way, not above doing that, but just explaining sort of under the hood. You have to create a whole set of criteria by which you decide what kinds of networks, what kinds of shows. And so the more that becomes subjective, the more it becomes not particularly scientific, because then, again, it's just observable stuff. So I think that over time we should probably do that, but we would probably need a lot of guidance from the field about what matters there in terms of what kinds of web shorts are we talking about, and how do we define web shorts? Less than 10 minutes, 5 minutes, 17 minutes, you know? Or a series, yeah. Yeah. I mean, you know, just looking at Netflix projects alone, I think is interesting for the future, because I don't know if you all know this, but Netflix now is not featuring independent curated films on its front page. It's promoting its own executive produced films. So that's a relatively recent change. So I'm going a little bit all over the place, but paying attention to those kind of patterns allow us to see Netflix is like the huge player now.
$6 billion in original programming.
So yeah, I love you all want to do research.
Denise on the interwebs asks, I understand that Academy Awards are one of the highest accolades for filmmakers. Are there other award-based competitions for doc filmmakers that are comparable or perhaps more balanced?
So we looked at what awards in the Oscar So White study. We also, again, we looked at 18,000 things, okay? Just not telling you, I'm picturing now our spreadsheet of data. We looked at what other awards, we wanted to know, are there particular awards that are actually predictive of the Academy shortlist? By the way, that's still working on whether or not we can do that. But we did look at other awards that actually matter, that are correlated with the Academy Award, and the one overall that really matters is the Cinema Eye Honors.
Can you tell us a little bit about how Cinema Eye picks that, how that works?
Well, that comes out of festivals.
No, it actually is decided by a group of festival programs.
That's right. Yep. So yes. So it's, I think, 6 or 7. It sounds like Debbie probably knows more. I have this written down somewhere, but it's 6 or 7 programmers from 6 or 7 festivals that nominate the films that are considered from their festival. So again, this is another reason why festivals are important to look at, because that is the closest corollary. They're not the awards that come from the entertainment industry. So we looked at Writers Guild Awards, DGA Awards. We looked at all Emmys, Peabodys, blah, blah. Yeah, anecdotally, they pop up, but they're not consistent in the way the Cinema Eye Honors are. And again, I had no agenda in starting. I mean, we were just coding for the stuff, right? And I was like, whoa, Cinema Eye Honors. So we looked up how it happened. The second award that matters that's correlated is the IDA Awards, actually. More than DGA, Emmys, Writers Guild, Producers Guild Awards, all the sort of industry standard awards. So that was interesting. So you know how to pick them.
Now there are so many platforms where you can distribute directly, whether it's VHX or Vimeo Pro and those type of things.
Yeah.
So I would be curious to see what the data for that is.
Again, it's that operationalization question on something like this that we did as a pilot study to see what would we find and then where will we go next in a deeper sense. It's purely a sort of operational, how do you create the criteria and boundaries and all of those things. Increasingly important is to look at, distribution, by the way, needs its own entire research project. I've said that for a long time. I spoke yesterday at MCon. And even in the conversation about how films have social impact or are relevant in social issues, we leave distribution out as this kind of appendage, like you make the movie and like it gets distributed. But distribution has everything to do with actually the moments that matter in terms of social change stuff, which is a whole, I'm not going to get into it, it's a whole different category.
It's the entire pie.
But yeah, a fully
That we're avoiding.
comprehensive, well-designed project about distribution, I think, is waiting. And again, we'll do that too. We need funding to do that.
I think she's just
do
up here to
everything.
get funding. I don't know.
No, I don't. I mean, again, we did these
I
for
love you.
free
I'm just
because
kidding.
they're really important to do, and we're not doing that. I mean, if we were in it for the money, we'd be doing something else.
And with that, we'll close. I think that's sort of the
Yeah,
documentary.
it's for love.
If we were in it for the money,
Yeah.
we'd do something.
Thank you, guys.
so
Thank
much.
you. Yeah, thank you all.